Sometimes the measure of a person isn't found in what they take, but in what they choose to give away. In a world where trust has become as rare as gold itself, one wealthy rancher decided to test a stranger's character and learned a lesson about his own. Rhett Lanton, the richest man in Cedar Bluff, left a pouch of gold coins on the saloon counter, pretending he'd forgotten them. Maren Doss, a quiet mountain woman passing through town, found the coins and took just one. She walked straight to the poorest cabin in town and handed it to a widow who hadn't eaten in days. When Rhett followed and saw what she'd done, he realized something that would shake him to his core. What would happen when Rhett discovered that the woman he tried to test had been testing him all along? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Cedar Bluff sat in the high country of Wyoming like a jewel in a rough setting, where the wind carried the scent of pine and sage across wide valleys, hemmed in by mountains that turned purple at dusk. It was 1889, and the town had grown fat on cattle and timber, its main street lined with false-fronted buildings that tried to look finer than they were. The railroad had come through 5 years back, bringing with it new money and new people, the kind who wore their ambition like cologne and measured success in dollars rather than handshakes. Rhett Lanton owned more of that success than any man in 3 counties. His ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime grazing land, and his cattle, Herefords with that distinctive white face and red coat, fetched top dollar in Chicago and Denver. At 42, Rhett cut a figure that commanded attention without demanding it. Tall and broad-shouldered, he favored well-tailored suits even when conducting ranch business, and his dark hair, just beginning to silver at the temples, was always neatly trimmed. His eyes were gray as winter clouds, sharp and assessing, the kind that seemed to calculate the value of everything they fell upon. But it was his hands that told the real story. They were ranchers' hands, scarred and calloused despite the fine clothes, evidence of a man who'd built his empire from more than just inherited wealth. Rhett had learned early that trust was a commodity easily spent and rarely repaid. His father, James Lanton Sr., had died when Rhett was 19, leaving him a modest spread and a mountain of debt his father's partner had conveniently forgotten to mention. That partner, a smooth-talking man named Vernon Cross, had walked away with half the proceeds from selling off the Lanton stock, leaving young Rhett with barely enough to keep the land. The experience had branded itself onto Rhett's soul like a hot iron. He'd clawed his way back through 15 years of calculated deals and careful investments, never again extending trust where money was involved, never again believing that a man's word meant more than the paper it wasn't written on. He'd prospered because he'd learned to see through people, to understand that everyone had a price. And that sentiment was just another word for weakness. The Lanton house was where Rhett spent most evenings, a saloon that catered to Cedar Bluff's more prosperous citizens. It wasn't a rowdy place. No gambling, no painted ladies working the rooms upstairs. Just good whiskey, better cigars, and the kind of quiet conversation where business got done without contracts or witnesses. The owner, Owen Shepherd, ran it with a firm hand and a careful eye. He'd been a ranch foreman before a horse rolled on his leg, leaving him with a limp and the need for a new profession. Owen was 10 years older than Rhett, with iron-gray hair and a weathered face that had seen too much sun and not enough luck. But he had a steady nature and a gift for reading people, which made him a good bartender and a better friend, though Rhett would never have used that word. Friends implied obligations, and obligations led to disappointments. "Evening, Rhett," Owen said, as Rhett settled into his usual spot at the end of the mahogany bar. The wood was scarred and worn smooth by decades of elbows, and Rhett liked the solidity of it, the way it had outlasted the men who'd built it. "Owen," Rhett nodded, accepting the whiskey that appeared without him having to ask. It was good bourbon, aged and smooth, and he sipped it slowly while his eyes swept the room. Sheriff Tom Ridley sat at a corner table with Harold Sims, the banker, their heads bent together over what looked like legal documents. Tom was a solid man in his 50s, honest as far as Rhett could tell, which meant he was either remarkably principled or remarkably good at hiding his corruption. Harold was another matter. Soft around the middle and sharp in the eyes, he'd come west from Philadelphia 10 years ago with Eastern money and Eastern manners, neither of which had much impressed the locals. But he controlled the loans, and that gave him power that didn't require respect. Rhett dealt with him because business demanded it. But he kept one hand on his wallet whenever Harold was in the room. The door opened, letting in a gust of cool evening air that carried the smell of approaching autumn. The woman who entered moved like she was used to mountain trails and uncertain footing, her steps deliberate and sure. She wore a man's wool coat over a simple dress, and her boots were scuffed and worn, but well-maintained. A canvas pack rode her shoulders, and her hat, wide-brimmed and weathered, shadowed a face that was neither young nor old, just worn by experience into something quiet and self-contained. Maren Doss. She'd been in town 3 days, staying at the boarding house run by Mrs. Adelaide Kent, and she'd caused more conversation than a preacher at a whorehouse. Not because she'd done anything scandalous, just the opposite. She'd helped Mrs. Kent repair a broken porch rail without being asked. She'd carried groceries for old Mr. Patterson when his arthritis was acting up. She'd sat with the blacksmith's sick daughter and sung her songs until the fever broke. People didn't know what to make of kindness that expected nothing in return. It made them suspicious, made them wonder what she was really after. Rhett had watched her from a distance, trying to figure out her angle, and the fact that he couldn't bothered him more than he cared to admit. She crossed to the bar, her movements unhurried, and ordered coffee from Owen. Not whiskey, not beer. Coffee. Another oddity in a woman who seemed made of them. "Evening, Miss Doss," Owen said, his tone friendly. He liked her, Rhett could tell, and Owen wasn't a man who liked people easily. "Mr. Shepherd." Her voice was low and pleasant, with an accent that suggested mountains and isolation, places where people still said what they meant and meant what they said. She didn't look at Rhett, though he was certain she knew he was there. She had that quality of awareness, like a wild thing that knew where all the predators stood. Rhett pulled his grandfather's pocket watch from his vest, checking the time more from habit than necessity. The watch was gold, heavy and substantial, with the Lanton family motto engraved on the inside of the case. "Trust is earned, not given." His grandfather had carried it through the California gold fields, and his father had carried it through the building of the ranch. Now it was Rhett's, a reminder that every generation had to learn the same hard lessons. He snapped it closed and tucked it away, his mind already working on the problem of Maren Doss. She was a disruption in the careful order of things, a variable that didn't fit into any of his calculations. And Rhett didn't like variables. They led to mistakes, and mistakes led to losses. And he'd promised himself a long time ago that he'd never lose again. The sheriff and banker concluded their business and departed, Tom tipping his hat to Maren as he passed. She nodded in return, that same quiet acknowledgement she gave everyone, as if a sheriff and a drifter stood on equal ground. Maybe in her world they did, but not in Rhett's. In his world, everything and everyone had a hierarchy, a value that could be calculated and leveraged. He finished his whiskey and stood, dropping coins on the bar for Owen. The bartender's eyes flicked to him, a question there that Rhett didn't acknowledge. Outside, the street was empty, the storefronts dark except for the general store where lamplight still showed in the upstairs windows where the owner lived with his family. The air was cool and clean, and somewhere a dog barked, the sound carrying across the quiet town. Rhett walked slowly back toward his hotel. He kept a room at the Cedar House rather than riding back to the ranch every night, his mind turning over possibilities. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow, he'd set his test in motion. He'd see what Maren Doss was really made of. See if she was genuinely as good as she appeared, or if she was just another con artist, working a longer game than most. Because in Rhett's experience, everyone was working an angle. The only question was how long it took to figure out what it was. He'd know soon enough. And when he did, when he'd proven to himself that even this quiet mountain woman had her price, he'd be able to dismiss the uncomfortable feeling she stirred in him. The feeling that maybe, just maybe, he'd become something his father wouldn't recognize. Something his grandfather would have been ashamed to see carrying that pocket watch. But that was sentiment talking, and Rhett Lanton didn't have time for sentiment. He had an empire to run, and empires weren't built on trust or kindness. They were built on knowing exactly what everyone wanted and being willing to pay just enough to get what you needed in return. Tomorrow he'd prove it, and then things could go back to the way they were supposed to be. The next evening came dressed in the amber light of late September, when the days still held warmth, but the nights promised frost. Rhett arrived at the Lanton house earlier than usual, carrying with him a leather pouch that clinked softly with the weight of 20 gold eagles. Each coin represented a double sawbuck, $20 in gold that could feed a family for a month, or buy a man's silence for considerably less. He'd chosen the pouch carefully that morning, selecting one that looked worn enough to be carried regularly, but fine enough to suggest real wealth. The coins themselves were freshly minted, their surfaces catching light like small suns. He'd counted them twice, not because he didn't trust his own arithmetic, but because he wanted to be absolutely certain of what he was putting at risk. Owen was behind the bar, polishing glasses with a white cloth when Rhett entered. The saloon was quiet, just a few regulars scattered at tables, their conversations a low murmur beneath the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Piano music drifted from the back room where someone was practicing scales, the notes climbing and falling like questions without answers. "Your usual?" Owen asked, but his eyes had already found the pouch in Rhett's hand, curiosity flickering across his weathered face. "Please." Rhett set the pouch on the bar with deliberate carelessness, positioning it near the edge where someone passing by might notice it. The leather was soft calfskin, dyed a rich brown, and the drawstring was tied loosely enough that the coins inside could be seen if someone looked closely. Owen poured the bourbon and set it down, his hand hesitating over the pouch. "That's a fair amount of gold to be leaving out in the open, Rhett. Just set it aside if it bothers you." Rhett's tone was casual, but he watched Owen's face carefully. The bartender was the first test. Would he say something or would he let it lie? Owen's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Your money, your business." But his eyes said he didn't like it, didn't approve of whatever game Rhett was playing. That was fine. Rhett didn't need approval. He needed information. Rhett took his drink to a table near the window, one that gave him a clear view of the bar and the door. He opened a newspaper, the Cheyenne Leader, and pretended to read about railroad expansion and cattle prices while his attention remained fixed on that leather pouch. Minutes passed, slow and measured by the clock's steady tick. The piano player finished their scales and moved into something more melodic, a hymn turned melancholy. The door opened at 7:15. Maren Doss stepped inside, bringing with her that same quality of quiet self-possession. She'd traded her coat for a shawl against the cooling evening, and her hair, dark brown threaded with early silver, was pulled back in a simple braid. Her eyes, he'd never been close enough to note their color before, were the deep green of pine forests, steady and clear. She crossed to the bar, her path taking her within 2 feet of where Rhett sat. He kept his eyes on the newspaper, but he could smell the clean scent of soap and wood smoke that clung to her. Could hear the soft tread of her boots on the plank floor. "Coffee, please." "Mr. Shepherd," she said when she reached the bar. Owen nodded and turned to the stove, where a pot stayed warm throughout the evening. His back was to the bar for perhaps 30 seconds, time enough for Maren to notice the pouch, time enough for her to make a choice. Rhett felt his pulse quicken despite himself. This was it, the moment when he'd see what she was really made of. Would she take it all? Would she take some and leave the rest? Or would she do the impossible and leave it untouched? The other patrons had noticed her by now. Conversations had dropped to whispers, and several men had turned in their chairs to watch. Word had spread about the strange mountain woman who gave more than she took. Some thought her touched by God. Others thought her touched in the head. But everyone was curious about what she'd do next. Owen returned with her coffee, setting it down on the bar, along with a small pitcher of cream. His eyes found the pouch, then flicked to Rhett, a question there that was almost an accusation. Rhett kept his face carefully neutral. Maren reached for the coffee and her hand paused. She'd seen the pouch. Her fingers hovered in the air for a moment, then changed direction. She picked up the leather pouch, weighing it in her palm, and the entire saloon seemed to hold its breath. The piano had stopped. Even the clock seemed to have paused in its ticking. Maren opened the drawstring and looked inside, her expression unchanging. Then, with movements that were neither hurried nor hesitant, she selected a single coin from the pouch, just one. She held it up to the lamplight, examining the eagle stamped on its face, then closed the pouch and set it back on the bar exactly where it had been. She pocketed the coin, picked up her coffee, and took a sip. Then she turned and walked toward the door without a word to anyone, without even a glance in Rhett's direction. The spell broke. Men turned back to their drinks, conversations resumed, and the piano player started up again, this time choosing a jaunty tune that felt wrong for the moment. Owen caught Rhett's eye, and there was something like disappointment in his expression, though whether it was directed at Rhett or the situation Rhett couldn't tell. Rhett stood quickly, leaving his newspaper and half-finished bourbon behind. He grabbed the pouch, still heavy with 19 gold coins, and followed Maren into the evening. The street was dimmer now, lamps being lit in windows, and the air had taken on that sharp quality that promised a cold night ahead. Maren walked with purpose, but not haste, her strides even and measured. She didn't look back, but Rhett was certain she knew he was following. She turned down Cedar Street, away from the boarding house and the main commercial district, heading toward the poorer section of town, where the houses were smaller and the gaps between them wider. Rhett kept his distance, staying in the shadows cast by buildings and trees. His heart was beating harder than it should have been, a mixture of vindication and something else he didn't want to name. She'd taken the money. Not all of it true, but she'd taken it. That meant she could be bought, just like everyone else. The amount didn't matter. The principle did. She stopped in front of a cabin that leaned slightly to the left, its roof patched with mismatched shingles and its chimney crumbling at the top. Smoke rose thin and grey from that chimney, barely enough to warm a room. A vegetable garden in front had gone mostly to weeds, and the fence around it was missing more pickets than it had. Maren knocked on the door, 3 soft raps that barely carried in the evening air. A moment passed, then the door opened, revealing a woman so thin she seemed made of shadows and grief. Temperance Grayson. Rhett knew her by reputation, a widow these past 2 years. Her husband killed in a logging accident that left her with 3 children and debts she could never repay. The 2 women spoke in voices too low for Rhett to hear. Then Maren reached into her pocket and pulled out the gold coin. She pressed it into Temperance's hand, closing the widow's fingers around it gently. The way you'd give a child something precious and fragile. Temperance's face crumpled, and she began to cry, silent tears that streaked down her hollow cheeks. She tried to speak, tried to refuse, but Maren simply shook her head and smiled, the first real smile Rhett had seen on her face. It transformed her, made her seem younger and older at the same time, weighted with a kindness that was both beautiful and terrible to witness. Then Maren turned and walked away, leaving Temperance standing in her doorway with $20 in gold and tears on her face. Rhett stood frozen, the pouch heavy in his hand, heavier than 19 gold coins should have been. His throat felt tight, and his chest ached with something that might have been shame, or might have been the death of certainty. He'd expected her to pocket the money, maybe spend it on herself, maybe save it. He'd never imagined this. She'd taken exactly what she needed to do, what she believed was right. Nothing more. And in doing so, she'd taken something from him he hadn't known he was offering, his assurance that the world worked the way he believed it did. He made his way back to the Lanton house in a daze, barely seeing the street in front of him. Owen looked up when he entered, his expression unreadable. "You get your answer?" The bartender asked quietly. Rhett set the pouch on the bar without a word. He retrieved his bourbon, now room temperature, and drank it in one swallow. The burn in his throat was welcome, something simple and physical to anchor him. "I don't know," he said finally. "I honestly don't know." And that uncertainty, more than anything else that had happened that evening, terrified him. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Rhett lay in his room at the Cedar House, staring at the ceiling while moonlight painted shadows across the plaster. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Temperance Grayson's face crumpling with gratitude, saw Maren's smile that held no triumph or superiority, just a quiet satisfaction in having done what seemed right to her. He'd built his life on certain truths. People were selfish. Trust was foolish. Kindness was a mask worn by those too weak to take what they wanted directly. But Maren had shattered those truths with a single gold coin and a widow's tears. And now Rhett found himself adrift in questions he didn't know how to answer. Morning came grey and cool, fog rolling down from the mountains to settle in the valley like wool. Rhett dressed carefully, choosing his clothes with the same precision he always did, but his hands fumbled with his collar buttons, and he had to tie his string tie twice. The face in the mirror looked older than it had yesterday, lines around the eyes deeper, mouth tighter. He found himself watching for Maren throughout the day. He saw her in the general store, helping Mrs. Patterson reach items on high shelves. Later, she was at the church, sweeping the front steps while talking with Reverend Miller about the upcoming harvest social. She moved through town like water through stone, quietly reshaping things without force or demand. Rhett tried to focus on his own business, contracts to review, cattle sales to negotiate. But his mind kept drifting back to that moment outside Temperance's cabin. What kind of person did that? What kind of person saw gold and took only what was needed for someone else? The answer came to him slowly, uncomfortably. Someone raised different. Someone who'd never learned that the world was a ledger to be balanced. That every transaction required calculating winners and losers. By the third day, Rhett's restlessness had grown to something he couldn't ignore. He needed to understand Maren Doss, needed to know what made her different. So he did what he always did when he wanted information. He asked questions. Sheriff Tom Ridley was working at his desk when Rhett stopped by the office, papers spread across the scarred wood surface. Tom looked up, surprise flickering across his weathered face. Rhett didn't make social calls. Rhett, something I can help you with. The woman staying at Adelaide's boarding house. Maren Doss. What do you know about her? Tom leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. Not much. She showed up about a week ago, paid for her room in advance with honest money. Adelaide says she's quiet, clean, doesn't cause trouble. Where's she from? Montana, I think. She mentioned the mountains up near the Bitterroot Range. Tom studied Rhett with those sharp lawman's eyes. Why the interest? Rhett shrugged, trying for casual. Just curious. She's been helping folks around town. Seems unusual. Unusual doesn't mean criminal. Tom's tone held a warning. Some people are just kind, Rhett. Hard as that might be for you to believe. The words stung because they were true. When had he become someone who couldn't recognize simple goodness? When had cynicism calcified into something so hard that kindness seemed suspicious? That evening, Rhett found himself at the Lantern House again, but this time he wasn't there to test anyone. He was there because he didn't know where else to go, and the silence of his hotel room had become oppressive. Owen served him whiskey without comment, then busied himself with other customers. The saloon was busier tonight, the usual Thursday crowd of ranch hands and merchants unwinding before the long push toward the weekend. Rhett sat alone at his table watching the door. Maren didn't come. Instead, it was Owen who eventually approached, carrying a bottle and 2 glasses. He sat down without invitation, poured for both of them, and fixed Rhett with a look that said this conversation had been coming. You going to tell me what that business with the gold was about? Rhett took a drink, letting the whiskey burn away some of the tightness in his chest. I wanted to see what she'd do. And she did something I didn't expect. Owen nodded slowly. She gave it away. To Temperance Grayson. Words all over town. Does that bother you? Why would it bother me? Owen refilled both glasses. What bothers me is you thinking you needed to test her in the first place. What bothers me is watching you become so twisted up inside that kindness looks like a con. Rhett wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Because Owen was right. Somewhere along the way, he'd lost the ability to accept things at face value. Every gesture had become suspect, every kindness a potential manipulation. "My father," Rhett said quietly, surprised to hear himself speaking about it. "He trusted people, trusted his partner. That trust nearly destroyed everything we had. So you decided never to trust anyone again." Owen's voice was gentle but firm. "That's not strength, Rhett. That's just another kind of fear." They sat in silence for a while, the noise of the saloon washing over them like distant surf. Rhett thought about his father, about the man who'd carried that gold pocket watch and believed the best of people until it killed him. James Lanton Sr. had died 6 months after his partner's betrayal, his heart giving out from stress and grief. Rhett reached into his vest and pulled out the watch, laying it on the table between them. The gold caught the lamplight, winking like a small sun. "Trust is earned, not given." Owen read the inscription through the open case. "Your family motto?" "My grandfather's. He learned it in the gold fields. My father forgot it. Maybe your father remembered. Something more important." Owen pushed the watch back toward Rhett. "Maybe he remembered that living without trust isn't really living at all." The words settled over Rhett like a weight, pressing down on all the careful defenses he'd built over the years. He'd thought he was being smart, being careful, protecting himself from the pain his father had endured. But what if he'd just been building a different kind of prison, one where he was both the guard and the prisoner? That night, alone in his room, Rhett went through his father's old trunk, something he hadn't done in years. Beneath faded account books and yellowed letters, he found a wooden horse, hand-carved from pine. His father had made it for him when Rhett was 6, spending evenings by lamplight with his whittling knife, creating something beautiful and useless, something made only from love. Rhett held the horse in his hands, feeling the smooth wood, the careful details of mane and tail. He remembered his father's hands, steady and patient, remembered his voice. "Wealth means nothing if you have no one to share it with, son. Remember that when you're grown." But he hadn't remembered. He'd built an empire and built it alone, measuring success in acres and dollars, never stopping to ask if the man in his father's stories would recognize the man Rhett had become. He set the horse on his nightstand where he could see it from the bed. Tomorrow, he decided, tomorrow he'd find Maren Doss and talk to her. Not to test her, not to catch her in some imagined deception, but to understand. To learn what she knew that he'd forgotten. Morning brought clarity and nervousness in equal measure. Rhett found Maren at the boarding house, sitting on the front porch with Adelaide Kent, both women shelling peas into a large wooden bowl. The domesticity of the scene should have been commonplace, but something about watching Maren's hands work, steady, practiced, unhurried, made Rhett pause on the walkway. Adelaide saw him first, her eyebrows rising. "Mr. Lanton, this is a surprise." Maren looked up, and those green eyes held no judgment, just quiet curiosity. "Good morning, Miss Doss." He removed his hat, feeling suddenly awkward. "I wonder if I might have a word with you, if you're not too busy. We're just about finished here." Maren set her bowl aside and stood, brushing her hands on her apron. "Adelaide, thank you for the company. Any time." "Dear." Adelaide's eyes moved between them with obvious interest, but she had the grace not to comment. They walked in silence for a moment, Maren waiting for him to speak, Rhett trying to find words that wouldn't sound foolish. The morning was cool, the sky a hard blue that promised a warm afternoon. Leaves on the cottonwoods along Main Street had started to turn, gold creeping in at the edges. "I owe you an apology," Rhett said finally. "What I did the other night, leaving that gold as a test, it was wrong. Why did you do it?" The question was asked without accusation, just genuine curiosity, and somehow that made it harder to answer. "I wanted to know if you were real," he admitted. "If the kindness you've shown was genuine or just another game people play." "And what did you learn?" "That I've forgotten how to recognize the difference." They'd reached the edge of town now, where the buildings gave way to open land. "Would you walk with me a bit?" "I'd like to talk, if you're willing." Maren studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I'm willing." They followed a trail that wound through scrub oak and sage, climbing gradually toward a ridge that overlooked the valley. Neither spoke for a while, and Rhett found himself grateful for the silence. It gave him time to gather his thoughts, to figure out how to explain things he'd never said out loud. "My father," he began when they'd climbed high enough to see the whole town spread below them, "was a good man, trusting, kind. He believed people were fundamentally decent, that a handshake meant something, that your word was your bond. Was he wrong?" Maren asked softly. "His business partner certainly thought so. Took half our stock and disappeared, left us with debts we couldn't pay. My father died 6 months later. The doctor said it was his heart, but I always knew it was the betrayal that killed him." Maren was quiet, her eyes on the valley below, where cattle grazed in distant fields. "And you decided never to be betrayed again." "I decided to be smart, to see people for what they really are, which is selfish. Looking out for themselves first, last, and always. That must be a lonely way to see the world. The simple observation cut deeper than any accusation could have." Rhett looked out at his empire, the land, the cattle, the town where his money touched nearly every business, and realized that for all he'd built, he couldn't name a single person he'd call friend. Owen, maybe, but even that relationship was defined more by routine than by trust. "I invited you here to tell you something," Maren said after a while. "I've been carrying it since I arrived, waiting for the right moment." Rhett turned to look at her, something in her tone making his pulse quicken. "I knew your father," she continued. "And I knew you, though you wouldn't remember. You were 9, maybe 10. I was a girl visiting relatives in Cedar Bluff. Fragments of memory stirred, dust motes in sunlight. A girl with dark braids and a quick laugh, helping his father mend fences while Rhett played with his wooden horse in the shade. "Maren," he said slowly, the name clicking into place with the memory of his father calling across a field. "You're James's niece," she nodded. "Your cousin. Second cousin, technically, but your father never bothered with technicalities. He treated me like his own." The world seemed to tilt, everything Rhett thought he understood, shifting into new configurations. "Why didn't you say something when you arrived?" "Because I needed to see what you'd become first." Her voice was steady but sad. "Your father wrote to me before he died, told me you were struggling, hardening yourself against the world. He asked me to check on you someday if I could. But life got in the way, my own family, my own losses. By the time I could come, 20 years had passed. What losses? A husband, 2 children, a fire that took everything." She said it simply, but Rhett heard the weight of grief beneath the words. 3 years ago. I survived because I was in town buying supplies. They didn't. God, Maren, I'm so sorry. After that, I couldn't stay in one place. The memories were too heavy. So I started traveling, helping where I could, trying to honor their memory by making the world a little better than I found it. She looked at him directly now. "When I came to Cedar Bluff and saw your name on the bank, on the businesses, I wondered if your father's request had been a fool's errand. If there was anything left of the boy I remembered. And the test?" Rhett's voice was rough. "That gold was my test of you, not yours of me. I needed to know if the Rhett your father loved was still in there somewhere. Buried under all that armor you've built." Rhett felt something crack inside him. A fissure in the wall he'd spent years constructing. "And what did you find?" "I found a man who's forgotten that wealth isn't measured in gold, who's built an empire but lost himself in the building." She reached out and touched his arm gently. "But I also found a man who followed me to see what I'd do with that coin, who's been watching and questioning and doubting. That man, he's worth saving." They stood together on that ridge, the wind moving through the sage, and Rhett felt the weight of 20 years pressing down on him. 20 years of careful distance, of calculated transactions, of measuring everything and valuing nothing that couldn't be counted. "I don't know how to be different," he admitted. "I don't know how to trust again." "You start small," Maren said. "You take one step, then another. You remember that your father's kindness wasn't weakness, it was strength. The kind of strength that lasts beyond a single lifetime. Will you stay?" The question came out before he could stop it. "In Cedar Bluff, I mean. Will you stay and help me figure this out?" Maren smiled, that same warm smile he'd seen her give Temperance Grayson. "I'll stay for a while, long enough to see if that boy your father loved can find his way back." They walked down from the ridge together, and for the first time in years, Rhett felt something other than the cold satisfaction of a good deal. He felt hope, and beneath that, like bedrock under soil, he felt the first stirrings of purpose beyond profit. But Cedar Bluff wasn't ready to make that transformation easy. By the time they reached town, word had already spread that Rhett Lanton had been seen walking alone with the mountain woman. In a place where reputation was currency and appearances mattered, that simple act of companionship had consequences neither of them had anticipated. Harold Sims arrived at Rhett's hotel room the next morning, a stack of documents under his arm and disapproval written across his soft features. He didn't wait for an invitation, just pushed past Rhett into the room and set the papers on the small table by the window. "We need to talk," Harold said, his Philadelphia accent more pronounced when he was agitated. "About these foreclosures." Rhett closed the door and crossed to look at the documents. There were 6 of them, each one a legal notice of default on mortgage payments. 6 families facing the loss of their homes and land. 6 more additions to someone's empire, probably Harold's own holdings, Rhett suspected, though the banker was clever about hiding his personal investments. "What about them?" "You hold notes on 3 of these properties. As a creditor, I need your signature to proceed with the foreclosure actions." Harold pulled out a pen and set it meaningfully on top of the papers. "Simple formality, really. These people have had plenty of time to make good." Rhett picked up the first document. The Hendricks family, a young couple trying to make a go of a small ranch north of town. He'd loaned them money 2 years ago for breeding stock, and they'd been paying it back steadily until this summer, when drought had hit their grazing land hard. The second was a widow named Abigail Foster, trying to hold onto her late husband's blacksmith shop while raising 2 boys alone. The third was a homesteader named Klaus Schmidt, a German immigrant who'd sunk everything into 60 acres of marginal land that would probably never produce enough to pay back what he owed. "These are good people," Rhett said slowly. "Having a bad year. These are defaulters, having the same bad year everyone else is managing to survive." Harold's tone was crisp, businesslike. "We can't run a bank on sentiment, Rhett. You of all people should understand that." A week ago, Rhett would have signed without a second thought. Business was business. Debt had to be paid. The world didn't stop turning because someone had a sob story. But now, looking at those names, he thought about Temperance Grayson's tears, about Maren's quiet conviction that people mattered more than ledgers. "Give them another 6 months," Rhett said, setting the papers down unsigned. Harold's face flushed. "Absolutely not. That sets a terrible precedent. Every deadbeat in the county will expect special treatment. Then let them expect it." Rhett met the banker's eyes steadily. "These families aren't deadbeats. Their neighbors having trouble. I won't be part of putting them out, won't be part of—" Harold sputtered, then regained control. "This is about that woman, isn't it? That Doss woman who's been filling your head with foolish notions about charity and kindness. This is about doing what's right. What's right is honoring contracts and maintaining the integrity of our financial system." Harold gathered up the papers with sharp, angry movements. "You're making a mistake, Rhett, a costly one. People are already talking about how you've changed, how you're not the businessman you used to be. Keep this up, and they'll start questioning whether you're fit to manage your own affairs, let alone theirs." After Harold left, Rhett sat for a long time looking at the wooden horse on his nightstand. His father would have refused to sign those foreclosure notices. His father would have found a way to help those families, even if it cost him. But his father had died broken and betrayed, and Rhett had spent 20 years making sure that would never happen to him, except now he wasn't sure which fate was worse, his father's broken heart or his own calcified one. He found Maren at Temperance Grayson's cabin, helping the widow plant a winter garden. Both women were on their knees in the dirt, their hands muddy, their faces flushed from work. 3 children played nearby, the youngest barely old enough to walk. Temperance looked up as Rhett approached, and something like fear crossed her face before she masked it. He realized with a start that she was afraid of him, this thin woman who'd once been married to a man Rhett had done business with. Afraid because he was rich and she was poor, because he had power and she had none. "Mr. Lanton," Temperance said, rising awkwardly to her feet. "I wasn't expecting. Is there something I can do for you?" "No," Rhett said quickly. I wanted to see how you were doing. After the other night, the gold Miss Maren gave me, it's been a blessing. I was able to buy food, pay the doctor for my youngest. I can't thank you enough. It wasn't my gold to give. That was all Maren's doing." Maren stood, brushing dirt from her knees. "The gold was yours, Rhett. I just knew where it was needed most." They finished the planting together, all three of them working in companionable silence while the children played. Rhett found himself enjoying the simple rhythm of the work, digging, planting, covering, patting the earth firm. His hands, so used to handling contracts and currency, remembered the feel of soil and seed from his youth. When the garden was done, Temperance invited them inside for coffee. The cabin was sparse but clean, everything in its place, everything worn from use but cared for with obvious love. Rhett saw the coins Maren had given her sitting in a jar on the mantel, clearly too precious to spend all at once. "Mr. Lanton," Temperance said as she poured coffee into mismatched cups, "I heard you refused to sign off on the foreclosures. That you stood up to Mr. Sims at the bank. Word traveled fast in a small town. It was the right thing to do. It was a brave thing," Temperance corrected gently. "Those families are grateful. We all are. It gives us hope that maybe things can be different, that maybe being poor doesn't mean being powerless." After they left, walking back toward town in the golden afternoon light, Maren was quiet. Rhett found himself watching her, trying to understand how she'd carried such grief and turned it into grace, how loss had made her more open rather than more closed. "You're thinking loud," Maren said with a small smile. "I'm thinking about how you do it, how you lost everything and still managed to give, because I learned that giving is how we heal," she said simply. "When my family died, I wanted to die too. For months, I just existed, going through motions. Then one day, I helped a stranger carry water from a well, and for just a moment the pain eased. So I helped another person, and another. Each small act of kindness was like a stitch, closing a wound that I thought would never heal. Does it get easier? No, but it gets bearable. And some days, that's enough." They walked in silence after that, and Rhett thought about stitches and wounds, about how he'd spent 20 years building walls when what he'd really needed was healing. The transformation he was undergoing wasn't comfortable. It hurt like feeling returning to frozen limbs. Painful and necessary in equal measure, but for the first time since his father's death, Rhett felt like he was moving towards something rather than running away from it. And that small shift in direction made all the difference. The decision came to Rhett in the small hours of the morning, when the world was quiet and he could think without the noise of other people's expectations. He would buy those distressed mortgages from Harold and forgive them outright. Not extend them, not renegotiate terms, just forgive them completely. The families would own their land free and clear, and Rhett would be out several $1,000s. His grandfather would have thought him insane. Vernon Cross, his father's betrayer, would have laughed. Even the Rhett of a month ago would have dismissed the idea as sentimental foolishness. But sitting in his room, with dawn creeping grey through the window, looking at that wooden horse his father had carved with such patient love, Rhett knew it was exactly what he needed to do. He didn't tell Maren, didn't tell anyone. Just went to Harold's bank that afternoon and made the offer, watching the banker's face cycle through surprise, suspicion, and finally greed as he calculated what he could gain from the transaction. "You're overpaying," Harold said, though he was already drawing up the papers. "These notes aren't worth half what you're offering. Then you're getting a good deal." Harold's eyes narrowed. "What's your angle here, Rhett? You planning to flip these properties?" "I'm planning to forgive the debts." The pen stopped moving. Harold stared at him like he'd announced plans to walk to California. "You're joking. I've never been more serious. That's the stupidest business decision I've ever heard." You'll set a precedent that will destroy lending in this entire county. People will think they can just stop paying their debts and some fool will come along and bail them out. Or people will think their neighbors care about them more than about profit. Rhett kept his voice level. Finish the paperwork, Harold. I'm buying those notes, Harold finished, but his hands shook with anger as he pushed the documents across his desk. You're making a terrible mistake, and when word gets out, and it will get out, you'll regret this. Rhett signed, paid, and left with the bundle of mortgage notes tucked inside his coat. They felt lighter than they should have, these papers that represented families' futures, homes, and livelihoods. He took them back to his hotel room and burned them in the small stove, watching the paper curl and blacken until nothing remained but ash. It should have felt like loss. Instead, it felt like freedom. But Harold had been right about one thing. Word did get out, and fast. By the next day, Cedar Bluff was buzzing with the news that Rhett Lanton had forgiven thousands of dollars in debt. The reactions were mixed. The families he'd helped were grateful, even tearful. The Hendricks came to thank him in person, the young wife crying so hard she couldn't speak. Klaus Schmidt, the German immigrant, shook his hand with such fervor Rhett thought his arm might come off. But the business community was less enthusiastic. Men who'd done deals with Rhett for years looked at him differently now, uncertainty in their eyes. Was this the same sharp businessman they'd known, or had something fundamental changed? And if he'd changed, could they still trust him to honor the old rules they'd all played by? The crisis came 3 days later, when Harold Sims arrived at the Lanton house with Sheriff Tom Ridley in tow. The banker's face was flushed, his movements jerky with barely contained fury. "Tell him," Harold demanded of Tom. "Tell him what I found." Tom looked uncomfortable, his hat in his hands. "Rhett, I need to ask you some questions about certain financial transactions. Harold's brought some irregularities to my attention." "What kind of irregularities?" "The kind that involve embezzlement and fraud," Harold snapped. "The kind that could see you in prison." The saloon had gone quiet. Every eye was on them, and Rhett could feel the weight of the town's attention. This was it, the retaliation Harold had promised, the consequence of stepping outside the accepted rules. "That's a serious accusation," Rhett said calmly. "What evidence do you have?" Harold pulled out a ledger, slapping it down on the nearest table. "This shows a pattern of improper transfers from the bank to your personal accounts. Money that should have gone to pay creditors, money that disappeared into your holdings." Rhett looked at the ledger, his mind working quickly. The entries were real enough, but they were also incomplete, carefully selected to make legitimate transactions look suspicious. Harold had been clever, pulling just enough truth to build a convincing lie. "Those were authorized loans," Rhett said. "Every one of them properly documented. Then where's the documentation?" "Because I've searched the bank records and found nothing." "Because Harold had removed it," Rhett realized, "or never filed it in the first place." The banker had been planning this for a while, setting up a trap to spring if Rhett ever stepped out of line. And forgiving those mortgages had been exactly the provocation Harold needed. "I have copies," Rhett said, though he wasn't certain he did. "In my office at the ranch." "Then I suggest you produce them," Tom said, his tone apologetic but firm. "I can't just ignore accusations like this, Rhett. Not even for you." Before Rhett could respond, Owen stepped forward from behind the bar. "That ledger's a fake," Harold spun on him. "How would you know?" "Because I've seen you working on it, right here in this saloon 3 weeks ago. You were copying entries from another book, changing dates and amounts. I didn't think much of it at the time, figured it was bank business. But now I understand what you were doing." Harold's face went from red to white. "That's a lie. You're just protecting your friend." "I'm protecting the truth." Owen's voice was steady. "And the truth is, you've been skimming from those foreclosure sales for years, taking more than your commission, hiding it in fake fees and inflated assessments. I've heard you and your associates talking about it when you thought no one was listening." The silence in the saloon was absolute. Tom looked from Owen to Harold, his lawman's instincts clearly telling him that Owen was speaking truth and Harold was not. You can't prove," Harold stuttered, but his face had already convicted him. I can prove it, Rhett said quietly. I've been collecting information about your deals for years, Harold. Insurance, I called it. Evidence of every questionable transaction you've ever made. I never planned to use it, but if you're going to accuse me of crimes you've committed, I'll bring every piece of documentation I have to the sheriff's office. It was a bluff, but a good one. Rhett did have some documentation. Any careful businessman did, and Harold couldn't know how much or how little it actually proved. Harold looked between them, trapped and knowing it. Then he grabbed his ledger and pushed past Tom toward the door. "This isn't over," he snarled. Not by a long shot, but everyone in the room knew it was. Harold had overplayed his hand, and now his own corruption was exposed. By morning he'd be gone, either arrested or fled, but gone either way. After the commotion died down and Tom left with promises to investigate Harold's affairs, Rhett bought Owen a drink. "Thank you," he said simply. "Don't thank me. I just told the truth." Owen raised his glass. "But I'm glad to see you're finally becoming the man your father raised you to be." That night, Rhett walked out to find Maren sitting on the boarding house porch, watching the stars. He told her everything, about the mortgages, about Harold, about Owen's defense and Harold's exposure. "So it's done," Maren said when he finished. "You've chosen your path. I've chosen to try," Rhett corrected. "But I'm going to make mistakes, going to fall back into old habits." "Probably," she agreed. "But now you'll have people to help you back up. That's what community is, not perfection, but support." They sat together in the cool evening air, and Rhett felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years. He felt like he belonged. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered with the regular mail to the hotel. Rhett almost didn't open it, seeing only the return address from a law office in Helena, Montana. Probably another business matter, another contract to review. But something about the weight of the envelope made him pause, and he opened it standing by the window, morning light falling across the single sheet of paper inside. It wasn't a business letter. It was something much more personal and much more devastating. The lawyer was writing to inform him that certain property belonging to James Lanton of the Bitterroot region had finally been settled in probate. 3 years after the fire that had claimed the lives of James, his wife Catherine, and their 2 children. The delay had been due to difficulty locating living relatives, and the lawyer apologized for not reaching out sooner. Rhett read the words 3 times before their meaning fully registered. James Lanton, the Bitterroot region. 3 years ago. His hands started shaking. James Lanton had been his uncle, his father's younger brother, who'd moved to Montana 30 years ago to start a ranch. The uncle who'd raised Rhett for 2 years after his mother died, before Rhett's father remarried. The uncle whose daughter had visited Cedar Bluff one summer, a girl with dark braids who'd helped with the fence mending. A girl named Maren. The letter slipped from his fingers, drifting to the floor like a fallen leaf. He stood frozen, his mind racing through implications and connections. Puzzle pieces snapping into place with sickening clarity. Maren had known who he was from the moment she arrived in Cedar Bluff. She'd known they were family. She'd known about his father's death, about Vernon Cross's betrayal, about everything that had shaped Rhett into the man he'd become. And she hadn't said a word. No, she had said something. Yesterday on the ridge, she'd called herself his cousin, had mentioned her father's request. But Rhett had been so focused on her losses, so caught up in his own emotional revelation, that he hadn't pressed for details, hadn't asked the obvious questions. He picked up the letter, reading more carefully now. The fire had been ruled accidental, a lantern knocked over in the barn, spreading too quickly to stop. Maren Lanton, now Maren Doss after her marriage, had been the sole survivor, having been in town at the time. She'd inherited the property, but according to the lawyer, she'd never claimed it, never returned to settle the estate, because she'd been wandering, Rhett realized, carrying her grief from town to town, helping strangers because she couldn't help the family she'd lost. And she'd come to Cedar Bluff not by chance, but by design, to fulfill a promise to a dead uncle, to see if the cousin she remembered could be saved from the bitterness that had consumed him. The test with the gold took on new meaning now. It hadn't been Rhett testing Maren. It had been Maren testing him from the very beginning, seeing if there was enough of his father's son left inside him to be worth saving. Rhett sat heavily in the chair by the window, the letter crumpling in his grip. He felt betrayed, manipulated, used. All those conversations, all that seeming kindness, had any of it been real? Or had it all been part of an elaborate scheme to reform him, to turn him into something he wasn't? But even as the anger rose, another part of his mind, the part that was slowly learning to see beyond his own hurt, reminded him that Maren had lost everything. Her husband, her children, her home. She'd survived a tragedy that would have broken most people, and instead of drowning in grief, she'd turned her pain into purpose. She'd come to Cedar Bluff not to use him, but to honor a promise. To try to save family, because family was all she had left. He found her at the church, helping Reverend Miller organize donations for the Harvest Social. She looked up when he entered, and something in his face must have told her that he knew, because her hands stilled on the boxes she was sorting. "Rhett, when were you going to tell me the rest?" His voice was steady, but barely. "When were you going to tell me you're not just some distant cousin, but Uncle James's daughter? That your father died in that fire along with your mother and your children?" Maren set down the box she was holding and turned to face him fully. "I told you yesterday that I'd lost my family. I told you about the fire. You told me pieces, fragments, not the whole truth. What truth did I leave out? That your uncle was my father? That the children who died were your second cousins? Would knowing that have changed anything? It would have changed everything." The words came out louder than he intended, echoing in the quiet church. Reverend Miller discreetly slipped out a side door, giving them privacy. "You let me pour out my heart to you, tell you things I've never told anyone, and all the while you were—" "What? Studying me? Testing me?" "Yes," Maren said simply. "I was testing you, just like you tested me with that gold. The difference is, I was testing whether you were worth the effort it would take to help you, not whether you were worth trusting. And what gave you the right to make that decision?" "A letter from my father." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a worn envelope, the paper soft from much handling. "He wrote this 6 months before he died. Before the fire. He'd heard about your father's death, about how you'd changed. And he asked me, if anything ever happened to him, to find you and try to bring you back to the family you'd pushed away." She held the letter out, and after a moment's hesitation, Rhett took it. The handwriting was instantly familiar. Uncle James's bold, clear script, the same writing that used to appear on birthday cards and Christmas letters when Rhett was young. "Dear Maren," it began. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I need to ask you one last favor. Your cousin Rhett, you remember him from that summer you spent in Cedar Bluff? He's struggling. Lost his father, lost his way, lost himself in bitterness and business. His father would have wanted someone to help him find his way back. And since I won't be there to do it, I'm asking you, find him. Remind him that family means more than money, that trust is worth the risk, that love is the only wealth that matters. He won't make it easy. He's built walls higher than any mountain. But if there's anyone who can climb those walls, it's you. You've always had your mother's heart, fierce and gentle and stubborn as stone. Use that heart to save our boy. Save him from becoming something his father would weep to see. With all my love, Dad." Rhett's eyes blurred as he read. His throat felt tight, his chest aching with a complex tangle of emotions he couldn't begin to separate. Grief for the uncle he'd lost, shame for the years he'd wasted, gratitude for the cousin who'd carried this burden for him, and beneath it all, a fierce love for the family he'd forgotten he had. "He called me our boy," Rhett said, his voice breaking on the words. "You were his boy," Maren said gently. "You and your father both. He never stopped loving you, even when you stopped writing, even when you pushed everyone away. I didn't know he'd died. I didn't know any of you had—" He couldn't finish. The weight of his own isolation, his self-imposed exile from family, pressed down on him with crushing force. Maren crossed to him, taking his hands in hers. Her hands were work-roughened and warm, and they held his with a strength that spoke of survival and grace. You know now, she said. And knowing, you can choose. You can be angry that I didn't tell you everything from the start. You can push me away like you've pushed away everyone else who tried to care about you. Or you can accept that sometimes love requires testing, requires patience, requires meeting people where they are and hoping they'll choose to become who they could be. I don't know how to be who I could be, Rhett admitted. I've been someone else for so long, then we'll figure it out together. Because that's what family does. She smiled, tears shining in her eyes. That's what my father asked me to do, and that's what your father would have wanted. We're the only Lantons left, Rhett. The only ones who remember the family motto your grandfather carved on that watch you carry. The only ones who can decide whether trust is earned. Not given was wisdom or just fear. Rhett looked down at their joined hands, at the physical connection that represented something deeper, something he'd been running from for 20 years. Family, trust, the terrifying vulnerability of letting someone matter. Maybe both, he said finally. Maybe it was wisdom born from fear, and maybe I need to learn a different kind of wisdom, one that doesn't leave me so alone. Maren squeezed his hands. You're not alone anymore. You haven't been since the moment I walked into Cedar Bluff. You just didn't know it yet. And standing in that quiet church, holding his cousin's hands while the afternoon light painted the windows gold, Rhett finally believed her. The letter from Uncle James became Rhett's most treasured possession, replacing the cynical motto engraved on his grandfather's watch with something warmer and more human. He read it every morning, letting his uncle's words remind him who he was supposed to be, who he was trying to become. But transformation, he was learning, didn't happen in isolation. It required action, required facing consequences, required standing firm when the world pushed back, and the world was about to push back hard. Sheriff Tom came to find Rhett 4 days after the revelation about Maren's identity. The lawman's face was grave, his usual warmth replaced by professional concern. We need to talk, Tom said. Privately. They went to Rhett's hotel room and Tom closed the door before speaking. Harold Sims made bail. Rhett felt his stomach tighten. I thought he'd run. Headed back east before charges could be filed. He did run straight to Helena. Turns out he has connections there. Business partners. Tom pulled out a worn telegram and handed it to Rhett. Partners who aren't happy about what happened here in Cedar Bluff. The telegram was brief and brutal. Deal with the Lanton situation. Permanently if necessary. Too much invested to lose now. V. Cross, Vernon Cross. The name hit Rhett like a physical blow. His father's former partner. The man who'd betrayed the Lanton family 23 years ago. He was still alive, still in business, and apparently still working with Harold Sims. How long have they been partners? Rhett asked, his voice tight. From what I can piece together, since Harold first came to Cedar Bluff, Cross set him up here, funded his initial investments. They've been working together to acquire distressed properties across the territory. Tom's expression was troubled. That foreclosure business Harold was running, it wasn't just about making money. It was about taking land, concentrating ownership, building a network of holdings that Cross controls from Helena. And I got in the way. You did more than that. You exposed their system, proved it could be beaten. If word spreads that someone successfully resisted their operation, other towns might start asking questions, looking closer at their own situations. Tom sat heavily in the chair by the window. Cross is coming here, Rhett. Him and some hired men. They're planning to make an example out of Cedar Bluff, show what happens to people who don't play along. When? 3 days, maybe 4. Depends on the roads. Rhett's mind raced, calculating possibilities and risks. He could run, take Maren and disappear into the mountains, let Cross have Cedar Bluff and everything in it. He could fight, gather men, make a stand, turn this into a war that would leave people dead and families destroyed. Or he could try something his father would have done. Something that required the kind of trust Rhett had spent years refusing to give. Call a town meeting, Rhett said. Tonight. Everyone needs to know what's coming. The church was packed that evening, every pew filled and people standing along the walls. Rhett stood at the front, looking out at faces he'd known for years but had never really seen. Temperance Grayson with her children, the Hendricks, holding hands like newlyweds. Klaus Schmidt, his weathered face anxious. Owen from the Lanton house, Reverend Miller, Adelaide Kent, all the people whose lives intersected with his, whose fates were now tied to the choice he'd made to forgive those mortgages. Maren stood beside him, her presence both comfort and reminder. This was what family did, stood together when trouble came. "Most of you know me," Rhett began, his voice carrying in the quiet space. "Some of you have done business with me. Some of you have borrowed money from me. And some of you probably think I'm just another rich man who doesn't care about anything except getting richer." A few uncomfortable shifts in the crowd, but no one disagreed. "You'd have been right to think that," Rhett continued. "Until recently I was exactly that man. But something happened that made me see things differently. Made me remember that my father didn't build his ranch to get wealthy. He built it to create something worth passing on. A legacy of more than land and cattle. A legacy of caring about your neighbors, of standing together when times get hard." He paused, letting his words settle. "Now that legacy is under threat, not from drought or hard times, but from men who see this town as nothing but property to be acquired. Men who've been working through Harold Sims to take your land, your homes, your livelihoods. And because I stopped playing their game, they're coming here to make sure no one else gets the same idea." The crowd stirred, fear and anger mixing in equal measure. Tom stepped forward and explained about Vernon Cross, about his network of corrupt land deals, about the threat he posed. "We have a choice," Rhett said when Tom finished. "We can scatter, sell out, while we can still get something for our property. Let Cross and his people have Cedar Bluff without a fight. Or we can stand together. Show them that this town isn't for sale, that we look after our own, that family, blood or chosen, means something more than profit." "Easy for you to say," a voice called from the back. Rhett recognized him, a rancher named Douglas, who'd always resented Rhett's success. "You've got money. You can rebuild somewhere else. What about the rest of us?" "You're right," Rhett acknowledged. "I do have money. And if we stand together, every resource I have is yours. Every dollar, every acre, every connection I've made over 20 years of business. I'm not asking you to fight my battle. I'm asking to stand beside you in yours. Because Cross isn't just after me. He's after all of us. And if we don't stand together now, he'll pick us off one by one until there's nothing left of Cedar Bluff but another name on his ledger." Maren stepped forward then, and the crowd quieted. They'd all heard about her by now, the mountain woman who'd become Rhett's cousin, who'd lost her own family and still found ways to help others. "I've been to towns Cross has touched," she said, her voice carrying clear and strong. "Places where the bank forecloses, where businesses fail, where families lose everything they've built. It always starts the same way. Divide the community, make them believe they're alone. Convince them that survival means looking out for yourself first. But I've also seen towns that fought back, that remembered they were stronger together than apart. Those towns survived. Those towns thrived. Not because they had more money or more guns, but because they had something Cross and his kind will never understand. They had each other." Temperance Grayson stood, her thin frame rigid with determination. "Miss Maren gave me gold when I had nothing. Mr. Lanton forgave my debt when no one else would. I don't have much to offer, but what I have is yours. My house can shelter people. My hands can work. My voice can stand with yours." One by one others stood. The Hendricks, Klaus Schmidt, Owen, even Douglas, the skeptical rancher, rose to his feet with a grudging nod. "What do you need from us?" Owen asked. Rhett felt emotion tighten his throat. This was what his father had known, what Uncle James had tried to teach him, that real wealth wasn't in bank accounts or property deeds. It was in this, people choosing to stand together when standing alone would be easier. "We need to prepare," he said, "not for war but for resistance. Cross will come expecting us to fold, to be intimidated. We need to show him a united front. Every deed, every mortgage, every loan gets documented and witnessed by multiple people. We need to make sure the law is on our side, that he can't use legal tricks to take what he wants." And we need to make sure everyone, especially the vulnerable families, has protection and support. They worked through the night, organizing and planning. Rhett opened his accounts, providing funds for families to pay off any remaining debts to the bank, eliminating leverage Cross might use. Maren coordinated housing arrangements, ensuring that isolated families moved into town temporarily, where they'd be safer in numbers. Tom deputized 12 men, giving them legal authority to protect property and maintain order. Adelaide Kent organized the women, setting up a system for feeding and housing anyone who needed it. Reverend Miller opened the church as a meeting place and shelter. Even the children helped, running messages between houses when adults were too busy. As dawn broke, Rhett stood on the church steps, looking out at Cedar Bluff. The town was transformed, no longer a collection of individuals pursuing separate interests, but a community knitted together by common purpose. Lights burned in windows up and down the street. People moved with determination, helping neighbors secure property, sharing resources, standing watch. Maren joined him, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. She offered him one, and they stood in companionable silence, watching the town wake to its new identity. Your father would be proud, she said softly. Uncle James, too. They'd both be proud. She looked at him, morning light catching the silver in her dark hair. You've become what they hoped you would be, not despite the pain you've carried, but because you finally let it transform you instead of define you. I'm scared, Rhett admitted. Not of Cross coming, scared that I'll fail these people, that my late conversion to caring won't be enough. It's not about being enough, Maren said. It's about being present, being honest, being willing to stand even when you're scared. That's all anyone can ask. Sheriff Tom approached, his expression serious but not alarmed. Riders coming in from the north. 3 men moving slow. It could be scouts, or it could be Cross coming early to catch us unprepared. Rhett set down his coffee. Either way, let's show them what Cedar Bluff looks like when it stands together. They walked down the steps side by side, Rhett and Maren, Tom and Owen, Temperance and the others who'd gathered. Not an army, just people who decided that what they'd built together was worth protecting. As they reached the center of town, other residents emerged from buildings to stand with them, forming a quiet line of solidarity across Main Street. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the night's cool air. In the distance, dust rose from the North Road, riders coming just as Tom had said. 3 men, then 5, then 7 as they got closer. And in the lead, on a fine black horse that spoke of wealth and power, rode a man Rhett hadn't seen in 23 years, but recognized instantly. Vernon Cross had come to Cedar Bluff, and Cedar Bluff was ready. Vernon Cross was older than Rhett remembered, but age had refined him rather than diminished him. Silver-haired and impeccably dressed even after a hard ride, he sat his horse like a man accustomed to being obeyed. His eyes, still sharp and calculating, swept across the assembled townspeople with the same assessing look Rhett recognized from his own mirror. The look of a man who measured everything in terms of advantage and weakness. The 7 men with him were hired muscle, the kind who wore guns openly and sat their saddles with the easy confidence of men who knew how to use violence and didn't much care about the consequences. But they pulled up short when they saw what faced them. Not a frightened, divided town, but a solid wall of citizens standing shoulder to shoulder across Main Street. Cross dismounted with deliberate slowness, making everyone wait while he removed his riding gloves and tucked them into his belt. When he finally looked up, his gaze found Rhett immediately, and something like amusement flickered across his weathered features. Well now, Cross said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. Little Rhett Lanton, all grown up and playing at being a civic leader, your father would have found that amusing, given how poorly his own civic-mindedness served him. The jab was calculated to provoke, but Rhett had spent weeks learning to look past his own reactions, to think before acting. He stepped forward, keeping his hands visible and his posture non-threatening. Mr. Cross, it's been a long time. 23 years, give or take. I hear you've been interfering with my business interests in Cedar Bluff, forgetting debts, exposing my associates' operations, turning simple commerce into some kind of moral crusade. Cross smiled, but there was no warmth in it. That's disappointing, Rhett. I thought you'd learn better. Thought you understood how the world really works. I learned from the best, Rhett replied evenly. You taught me that trust was foolish, that kindness was weakness, that the only thing that mattered was winning. Took me 20 years to realize those weren't lessons. They were poison. Cross's smile faded. Careful, boy. You're standing in front of a lot of people who could get hurt if you make this harder than it needs to be. Sheriff Tom stepped forward, his badge catching the morning light. That sounds like a threat, Mr. Cross, and threats against citizens of Cedar Bluff are crimes I take seriously. Not a threat, Sheriff. Just an observation. Cross's eyes moved from face to face, evaluating, calculating. I've acquired considerable property in this territory over the years. Legal acquisitions all properly documented. Harold Sims was my agent here, and while his methods may have been aggressive, they were within the bounds of law. What wasn't within the law was Rhett Lanton's interference with lawful foreclosure proceedings. Foreclosures based on fraudulent assessments and inflated interest rates, Tom countered. We've been reviewing Harold's files. Found enough irregularities to keep lawyers busy for years. Lawyers cost money, Cross said. Money these good people don't have. By the time any court rules on those alleged irregularities, most of these families will be bankrupt just from legal fees. He looked directly at Rhett. Is that what you want for them? Years of uncertainty, watching their savings drain away fighting battles they can't win? Or do you want to be reasonable? Let me make you an offer. I'm listening, Rhett said, though he had no intention of accepting anything Cross proposed. I'll forgive all outstanding debts connected to Harold's operations. Clean slate for every family in Cedar Bluff. In return, you sell me your ranch. Fair market value, paid in full, no questions asked. You take your money, leave the territory, and everyone else gets to keep their homes and their pride. It was a clever offer. Generous enough to sound reasonable, specific enough to make Rhett the only obstacle to peace. If he refused, he'd look like he was sacrificing his neighbors for his own principles. If he accepted, Cross would have the largest and most valuable property in the region, plus the satisfaction of driving the last Lanton out of Wyoming. Rhett felt the weight of expectation from the people around him. Saw Temperance's worried face, the Hendricks holding each other tight, Klaus Schmidt's weathered hands clenched at his sides. They'd stood with him, trusted him, and now he had to decide whether their trust was justified. He thought about his father, about Uncle James, about the pocket watch in his vest and the wooden horse on his nightstand. He thought about what real wealth meant, what legacy he wanted to leave. No, Rhett said simply. Cross's expression hardened. That's your final answer? You'd rather see these people suffer than accept a generous offer? What I'd rather do, Rhett said, his voice strengthening, is see these people stand on their own land, in their own town, free from men who think money gives them the right to take whatever they want. Noble words, Cross said. Let's see if they're still on your lips when this is over. What happened next came so fast that later, when people told the story, they could never quite agree on the sequence of events. What everyone did agree on was that it started when Harold Sims, who'd been riding at the back of Cross's group, suddenly spurred his horse forward and drew his pistol. "This ends now," Harold shouted, his face flushed with rage and humiliation. He aimed at Rhett, his hand shaking but determined. Tom moved faster than a man his age should have been able to, drawing his own weapon and firing in one smooth motion. The shot took Harold in the shoulder, spinning him in his saddle. His pistol discharged into the air as he fell, landing hard in the dust of Main Street. The moment fractured. Everyone reaching for weapons, horses dancing nervously, women pulling children back toward the buildings. Rhett found himself looking down the barrels of 3 different guns, Cross's hired men having drawn faster than anyone could react. But then something extraordinary happened. Temperance Grayson stepped forward into that deadly space between armed men, her thin frame seeming to grow larger with determination. In her hand, she held something that caught the morning light, a single gold coin, the one Maren had given her weeks ago. "Stop," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Just stop and look at what you're doing." One of Cross's men, a hard-faced rider named Kemper, sneered at her. "Get back, woman. This doesn't concern you. It concerns all of us," Temperance said. She held up the coin so everyone could see it. "This is what Mr. Lanton left on a bar counter. This is what Miss Maren took to help a widow and her children. This single coin bought food and medicine and hope. It bought more than you could understand with all your guns and your threats and your legal papers." Other people began stepping forward, each one holding something or telling a story. The Hendricks showed the deed to their property, now free and clear. Klaus Schmidt spoke in his thick accent about the lumber Rhett had donated to repair his barn. Owen told about the nights Rhett had sat with him, learning to see people as more than transactions. Adelaide mentioned the donations to her boarding house that let her take in families who couldn't pay. One by one, they testified not to Rhett's wealth or power, but to the small acts of kindness that had transformed their town. And as they spoke, Cross's men began to lower their weapons, not from fear, but from something more uncomfortable: shame. These weren't just faceless victims to be intimidated. They were families, neighbors, people who'd built something together that was worth more than property or profit. And standing against them suddenly felt less like business and more like cruelty. Kemper was the first to holster his gun. "He didn't sign on to shoot widows and homesteaders," he said to Cross. "Find yourself another man for this job." 2 others followed his lead, turning their horses and riding away without looking back. That left Cross with 4 men, and the odds had shifted dramatically. Tom's deputies moved forward, hands on their weapons, ready but not aggressive. Cross looked around at the dissolving situation, at Harold bleeding in the street, at his hired men abandoning him, at the wall of townspeople who showed no sign of backing down. Rhett could see him calculating, trying to find an angle that would let him salvage something from this disaster. "This isn't over," Cross said finally, his voice tight with contained fury. "I have resources you can't imagine, connections that reach all the way to the territorial capital. He'll tie this town up in legal battles until—" "No," Maren interrupted, stepping forward. "You won't, because I have resources too, including detailed records of every fraudulent deal you've made in Montana over the past 20 years. My father kept meticulous accounts before the fire. I saved them, and I've already sent copies to a federal marshal in Denver, along with testimony about your network of corrupt land acquisitions. It was a bluff. Maren had no such records, but Cross didn't know that. His face went pale, then red, his hands clenching into fists. "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe," Maren agreed. "Or maybe you should ride back to Helena and start preparing your defense. Either way, you're done in Cedar Bluff." The standoff held for another moment, Cross weighing options and finding them all unfavorable. Finally, with a curse that would have made cowboys blush, he mounted his horse and spurred it north, his remaining men following. They left Harold behind, bleeding and forgotten in the dust, a fitting end for a man who'd traded loyalty for profit. Tom's deputies moved to secure Harold and tend his wound. The crowd began to relax, tension bleeding away into relief and cautious celebration. Rhett found himself surrounded by people shaking his hand, thanking him, crying with joy that their homes and livelihoods were safe. But all he could see was Temperance Grayson, still holding that single gold coin in the morning sun. One coin that had bought more than 20 ever could have. One coin that had changed everything. 3 months passed before Rhett truly understood what had changed in Cedar Bluff and in himself. The town had transformed in ways both visible and subtle. New businesses opened along Main Street, funded by a community investment pool Rhett had established with part of his fortune. The struggling families now had secure title to their properties, and more importantly, they had something they'd lacked before: confidence that their neighbors would stand with them when trouble came. Harold Sims had been tried and convicted, serving time in the territorial prison. Vernon Cross had indeed fled back to Helena, where federal marshals, alerted by letters Maren actually did send, were investigating his business practices. The network of corrupt land deals was unraveling across Montana and Wyoming, freeing dozens of communities from the same exploitation Cedar Bluff had narrowly escaped. But for Rhett, the real transformation was quieter and more personal. He'd moved his base of operations from the hotel to the ranch, opening the main house to guests and family rather than keeping it as a monument to his own isolation. Maren had stayed as she'd promised, taking up residence in the guest wing and filling the empty rooms with life and laughter. Together, they'd begun the work of not just rebuilding the Lanton legacy, but redefining it. On a cool November afternoon, Rhett found himself back at the Lanton house, sitting at his usual table with Owen, but this time he wasn't there to conduct business or maintain distance. He was there because Owen was his friend, and friends spent time together for no reason beyond enjoying each other's company. "You've changed," Owen observed, pouring them both coffee instead of whiskey. "Not just in what you do, but in how you carry yourself. You look lighter somehow." "I feel lighter," Rhett admitted. "Turns out holding on to all that bitterness and suspicion was exhausting." "Who knew?" Owen laughed. "Anyone who wasn't too stubborn to ask." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the late afternoon light paint the saloon's windows gold. The place had changed too. More families came in for meals now, children playing in the back, while parents talked about crops and weather and the small details of daily life. Owen had added a community bulletin board where people could post jobs, trade goods, or ask for help. The Lanton house had become what Rhett suspected Owen had always wanted it to be, a genuine gathering place rather than just a watering hole. "Your father would be proud," Owen said eventually. "What you've built here, not the wealth, but the community. That's the kind of legacy that lasts. My father, and my uncle, and probably my grandfather too." Despite his motto about trust, Rhett pulled out the pocket watch, looking at the engraving with new eyes. "Trust is earned, not given. I used to think that meant never trust anyone. But I think my grandfather meant something different. That trust is precious because it has to be built, earned through action and time. Not that it should never be given, just that when you do give it, you're giving something valuable." "That's a healthier interpretation," Owen agreed. The door opened, and Maren entered, bringing with her the smell of wood smoke and autumn air. She crossed to their table, her smile warm and genuine. "There you are. I've been looking all over town." She pulled out a chair and sat. "Temperance wanted me to tell you that her cabin repairs are finished. The new roof is solid, the chimney's rebuilt, and she's planning a supper to thank everyone who helped." "You're both invited. We'll be there," Rhett said. Maren pulled something from her pocket and set it on the table between them. It was the gold coin, the one from that first test. The one Temperance had held up during the confrontation with Cross. Temperance had insisted Maren take it back, saying it had served its purpose and should return to the person who'd understood its true value from the beginning. "She wants you to have it," Maren said to Rhett. "She said you left it for her to find. And now she's leaving it for you to find again." Different people, same lesson. Rhett picked up the coin, feeling its weight in his palm. Such a small thing to have caused such a large change. He thought about that evening months ago when he'd left the pouch on the bar, so certain he was testing Maren when really she'd been testing him. So certain he understood how the world worked when really he'd been living in a prison of his own making. "I think I'll leave it at the bar again," he said slowly. "Not as a test this time, but as a reminder. For myself mainly. To remember that the measure of wealth isn't in what we keep, but in what we're willing to give away." He stood and walked to the bar, setting the coin where anyone could see it. Owen watched him, understanding in his eyes. Maren followed, standing beside Rhett as they looked at the coin gleaming in the lamplight. "Your father used to say something," Maren said softly. "He said that every generation has to learn the same lessons, but if we're lucky, we learn them a little easier, because the people before us left markers showing the way." "Is that what this is?" Rhett asked. "A marker?" "Maybe. Or maybe it's just a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness ripple out in ways we can never predict. You left that gold, thinking you were testing someone's honesty. Instead, you tested yourself and found out you were ready to change. That's worth more than all the gold in Wyoming. They walked out of the lantern house together as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. Rhett thought about the wooden horse on his nightstand, about Uncle James's letter, about his father's trust and his grandfather's caution. All of it was part of who he was, who he'd been, and who he was still becoming. The gold coin stayed on the bar, catching the light, waiting for someone else to find it, waiting to teach the next person the same lesson Rhett had finally learned, that true wealth isn't measured in what you can take, but in what you're willing to give. That trust once broken can be rebuilt. That family, blood or chosen, is the only fortune that really matters, and that sometimes the person you're testing is yourself. Cedar Bluff settled into evening, lights beginning to glow in windows up and down Main Street. In the distance, Rhett could see Temperance's cabin, smoke rising from its new chimney, a symbol of survival and community and second chances. His ranch lay beyond, no longer a lonely fortress, but a home waiting to be filled with family and friends. Maren walked beside him, her presence both anchor and compass, reminding him of who he'd been and pointing him toward who he could still become. They'd both lost so much, families, years, certainty about how the world worked. But in losing, they'd found each other and remembered that some things couldn't be measured in gold or counted in acres. Some things, like trust and family and the courage to change, were simply priceless. And Rhett Lanton, once the richest and loneliest man in Cedar Bluff, finally understood that he was wealthy beyond measure.